The wind howled through the canyon like a wounded animal, carrying with it the bite of an early winter that had caught everyone in the territory unprepared. Margaret Sullivan pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped out of her cabin to check the storm shutters. The sky hung low and gray, heavy with the promise of snow that would soon blanket the harsh landscape of the Arizona territory. She had lived alone for 3 winters now, ever since the Apache raid that took her husband Thomas and their boy, little James, who would have been 8 this past summer. The emptiness of the cabin behind her was a constant companion, as familiar as the ache in her joints when the cold set in. She'd grown used to the silence, to the way her own footsteps echoed on the wooden floors, to cooking meals for one and pretending she didn't notice how much salt pork was left over. The neighboring ranchers had stopped asking when she'd sell and move back east. They'd learned that Margaret Sullivan was as stubborn as the mesquite that clung to life in the desert soil. She'd buried her family in the small cemetery plot behind the hill, and she'd be buried there too when her time came. This land had taken everything from her, but it was all she had left of them. As she secured the last shutter, movement on the horizon caught her eye. A figure approached slowly, too slowly, swaying with each step like a drunkard or someone near collapse. Margaret's hand moved instinctively to the rifle propped against the doorframe. Out here, visitors rarely brought good news, especially those who came alone and on foot. But as the figure drew closer, Margaret lowered her weapon. It was a woman, an Apache woman by the look of her traditional dress, though it was torn and dusty from hard travel. She was old, her face deeply lined by sun and years, her gray hair escaping from beneath a worn headband. Blood stained the side of her dress, and her lips were cracked from thirst. The woman stumbled at the edge of Margaret's property line and fell to her knees, against every instinct that had kept her alive these 3 years. Margaret found herself running toward the fallen figure, her boots crunching on the frost-hardened earth. "Water," the Apache woman whispered in accented English when Margaret reached her. "Please." Margaret didn't hesitate. She helped the woman to her feet, surprised by how light she was, like a bird whose bones had hollowed with age. Together they made their way to the cabin, the Apache woman leaning heavily on Margaret's shoulder. Inside, Margaret settled the woman in the chair nearest the stove and fetched water from the barrel. The Apache woman drank slowly, her hands trembling around the tin cup. In the lamplight, Margaret could see the extent of her condition, exhaustion etched in every line of her face, feet wrapped in rags that had worn through to bloody flesh, the dark stain on her side that spoke of a wound gone bad. "I walked many days," the woman said when she'd finished drinking. Her English was careful, deliberate. "From the reservation, looking for you." "For me?" Margaret set down the water pitcher, puzzled. "I don't understand." The Apache woman reached into a pouch at her waist with shaking fingers and withdrew something wrapped in soft leather. She placed it on the table between them with the reverence one might show a sacred object. "My name is Aiyana. It means eternal blossom in my language. I come because—" She paused, gathering strength or perhaps courage. "Because I am dying, and my son needs what I cannot give him anymore." Margaret remained silent, watching as Aiyana unwrapped the leather to reveal a silver bracelet, intricately worked with symbols Margaret didn't recognize. Beside it lay a small wooden horse, half-carved, the knife marks still fresh in the soft pine. "My son, he is called Samuel by the whites, Ashki Sosi in our tongue, boy who draws. He is good with his hands, makes beautiful things." Aiyana's voice grew softer. "But his heart is broken like yours." "I don't understand what you want from me," Margaret said, though something cold was settling in her stomach. 3 summers ago, soldiers came to our camp. My husband fought. My daughter—" Aiyana's voice caught. "She was 15 summers, beautiful like the morning star. The soldiers, they—" She stopped, her jaw working as she swallowed words too painful to speak. "My son tried to protect her. He killed 2 soldiers before they brought him down. They thought him dead, left him bleeding while they finished their business." Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. She knew this story, had heard variations of it too many times. Violence begetting violence in an endless cycle that ground everyone to dust. He lived, Ayanna continued, but he wishes he hadn't. He speaks to no one now, stays at the edge of camp, carving wood until his fingers bleed. The other young men, they have found wives, started families. But my son, he looks at the world like it has already ended. Why come to me? Margaret asked, though she suspected she knew. Ayanna's dark eyes met hers, steady despite her weakness. Because you understand, I have watched you. Margaret Sullivan, yes, I know your name, know your loss. The Apache who raided your home. They were not from our band, but still, we all carry the weight of this war between our peoples. She leaned forward slightly. You need a husband. My son needs a heart that knows how to hurt like his hurts. A heart that might teach him to live again. Margaret stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. You can't be serious, after everything that's happened. You think I would, that he would? I think, Ayanna said quietly, that two broken things might make something whole, or at least something that can stand against the wind. She touched the bracelet on the table. This was his sister's, the horse. He was carving for her when she died. He carries them always, but I took them while he slept. He would be angry if he knew I came here. Then why? Because I am his mother, and I will not watch him fade like smoke when I go to the spirit world. Because you have strength enough to survive alone, but no one should have to. Because... Ayanna's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Because I dream of grandchildren who will know both worlds and might help heal the wounds between them. Margaret sank back into her chair, overwhelmed. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters she'd just secured. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in with the weight of all the empty years ahead. He will not come willingly, Ayanna continued. But if I die, he will bring my body home. It is our way. And if I die here, on your land... You planned this. Margaret's voice was flat, not quite accusatory. I am a mother. Ayanna's smile was tired but unrepentant. We do what we must for our children, even when they are grown, even when they hate us for it. Margaret looked at the dying woman before her, saw her own desperation reflected back. How many miles had Ayanna walked on those bloody feet? How much pain had she endured to make this last, impossible attempt to save her son? He won't want this, Margaret said. Neither of us would choose this. No, Ayanna agreed. But sometimes the Spirit chooses for us. Sometimes we must trust that two hearts that have known the worst pain might remember how to beat again. Together. She reached across the table, her weathered hand covering Margaret's pale one. I am not asking you to love him. I am asking you to let him stay when he brings my body home, to give him work for his hands and silence that is not empty, to see if two wounded souls might find peace in shared sorrow. That is all. Margaret stared at their joined hands, one dark and lined with age, one pale and roughened by work. The contrast should have meant something, should have reminded her of all the reasons this was madness. Instead, she thought of winter nights so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat, of cooking for one, of talking to graves that never answered back. He'll leave, she said, as soon as he can. Perhaps. Ayanna squeezed her hand gently. Or perhaps he'll find a reason to stay. Won't know unless the door stays open long enough to find out. The old woman was fading fast now, her breathing labored. Margaret helped her to the narrow bed in the corner, the one that had been James's. Ayanna lay back with a sigh that seemed to come from her very bones. The bracelet, she murmured. When my son comes, give it to him. Tell him his mother walked her last miles with courage. Tell him she was not afraid. Margaret sat beside the bed as darkness fell, keeping watch as she had once watched over her own family during their fevered last nights. Ayanna's breathing grew shallow, rattling in her chest like dry leaves. Near midnight, she spoke once more, her voice barely audible. Two broken things might make something whole. Then she was gone, slipping away as quietly as she had lived her last days. Margaret closed the old woman's eyes and pulled the blanket over her still form. She stood there in the lamplight, looking down at this stranger who had walked to death to try to save her son, who had seen in Margaret something worth hoping for. Outside, the first snow began to fall, white flakes dancing in the wind like spirits. Margaret picked up the silver bracelet from the table, running her fingers over the intricate patterns. Somewhere out there, a man named Samuel Ashkeet-Sosi, boy who draws, would soon learn his mother was gone. He would come for her body, as duty and love demanded, and Margaret would open her door to him, because a dying mother had asked her to, because sometimes, in this hard land that took everything and gave nothing back, the only kindness left was to shelter another's grief alongside your own. She sat by the window and began her watch, the bracelet cool in her palm, waiting for a stranger's son who carried the same darkness she knew too well. The snow continued to fall, covering the harsh landscape in temporary softness, hiding the scars beneath. 3 days passed before he came. Margaret had wrapped Ayana's body carefully in her best quilt, the one her mother had made for her wedding, and kept it in the cold storage cellar. She maintained her vigil by day, going about her chores with one eye always on the horizon, and by night she sat by the window with a lamp burning, the silver bracelet never far from reach. She saw him first as a dark speck against the snow-covered mesa, moving with the steady, ground-eating pace of someone who had walked many miles and had many more to go. As he drew closer, she could make out details, tall and lean, dressed in a mixture of Apache and white man's clothing, a rifle slung across his back. He moved like a man who expected trouble but was too tired to care if it found him. Margaret stepped out onto the porch as he approached, her hands empty but near enough to the rifle propped by the door. He stopped at the same property line where his mother had fallen, and for a long moment they regarded each other across the distance. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 25 winters, with his mother's strong features softened by youth and hardened by loss. His hair was long, tied back with a leather cord, and his dark eyes held the same emptiness she saw in her own mirror each morning. Those eyes flickered to the cabin, searching. "She's here," Margaret called out, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Your mother. She passed 3 nights ago." Something shifted in his face, a tightening around the mouth that might have been grief or might have been anger. He walked forward then, stopping a few feet from the porch steps. Up close, she could see the pallor beneath his sun-darkened skin, the hollow of sleepless nights beneath his eyes. "I am Samuel Sosi," he said. His English was better than his mother's, with only a slight accent coloring the words. "I've come for her." Margaret nodded. "She told me you would. I kept her safe. In the cold." She led him to the cellar, lifted the heavy door. The smell of earth and winter rose up to meet them. Samuel descended without hesitation, and Margaret followed with a lantern. Ayana's wrapped form lay on the wooden platform Thomas had built for storing meat through the summer. Samuel knelt beside his mother's body, one hand resting lightly on the quilt. He stayed like that for a long time, so still he might have been carved from stone. Margaret waited, understanding the need for this silence, this private moment of goodbye. Finally, he stood. "This quilt, she should have something fine," Margaret interrupted. "For her journey." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw surprise flicker through the emptiness. "You prepared her with honor." "She died with courage," Margaret said, remembering Ayana's words. "She wanted you to know she was not afraid." Samuel lifted his mother's body easily, cradling her against his chest like a child. They climbed back into the daylight, and he laid her gently in the back of the small wagon he'd left at the edge of the property. Margaret noticed his horse then, a paint mare that stood patiently despite the cold. "There's something else," Margaret said as he arranged blankets around his mother's form. She went into the cabin and returned with the bracelet and the half-carved horse. "She wanted you to have these back." Samuel's whole body went rigid. He stared at the objects in Margaret's outstretched hands, as if they were snakes that might strike. "She had no right," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "She was your mother." Margaret replied simply, "She did what mothers do." "Did she tell you?" His words were sharp enough to cut. "Did she tell you what these are? What they mean?" "She told me enough." Samuel laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "Enough! Did she tell you how my sister screamed? How I lay there bleeding, listening, unable to move? Did she tell you how I found her body afterward? What they had done?" His hands clenched into fists. "Did she tell you that I carry these to remember my failure?" Margaret held steady under his anger, recognizing it as she recognized her own. "She told me you tried, that you killed 2 men defending her. Not enough." He spat. "Not nearly enough." "No," Margaret agreed quietly. "It never is." That stopped him. The simple acknowledgement of a truth they both knew. He looked at her again, seeing perhaps what his mother had seen, another soul marked by loss and guilt. "Why did she come here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected. Margaret could have lied, could have made up some story about Ayanna seeking shelter in the storm. But this man deserved truth, as his mother had deserved it. "She thought we might help each other. 2 people who understand certain kinds of pain." Samuel's laugh this time was softer but no less bitter. "My mother the matchmaker, even unto death." He took the bracelet and horse from Margaret's hands, his fingers careful not to touch hers. "She was a fool, perhaps," Margaret said. "But she walked until her feet bled to try one last time to save you. Fools don't often love that hard." He had no answer for that. Instead, he busied himself securing the wagon, checking the horse's harness with hands that weren't quite steady. Margaret watched him work, noting the careful way he moved, the gentleness with the animal despite his anger. "The ground's too hard for digging," she said when he'd finished. "Until the spring thaw, at least. There's a place up in the canyon where the Apache used to build scaffolds. I could show you, if you want to." "I know the place." Samuel cut her off. But then, softer, "Thank you." He climbed onto the wagon seat, gathered the reins. Margaret thought he would leave then without another word. But he surprised her. "She told you nothing else? Made no requests?" Margaret met his eyes steadily. "She asked me to leave my door open if you chose to return. Said you might need work for your hands and silence that wasn't empty. Nothing more. And you agreed to this?" "I agreed to nothing except to tell you she wasn't afraid at the end." Samuel studied her for a long moment. Then he clicked to the horse and the wagon rolled forward. Margaret watched until he disappeared into the canyon's mouth, taking his mother on her final journey. She spent the rest of the day setting the cabin to rights, though there was little that needed doing. As evening fell, she found herself standing in the doorway of the small room that had been James's, looking at the narrow bed where Ayanna had died. The old woman's presence seemed to linger, patient and determined even in death. Margaret closed the door and went to prepare her solitary supper. She didn't expect to see Samuel Sosi again, but the next morning, she woke to the sound of wood being split in her yard. Through the frost-covered window, she saw him by the woodpile, swinging the axe with mechanical precision. The paint mare grazed nearby, ground-tied and peaceful. Margaret dressed quickly and stepped onto the porch. Samuel didn't acknowledge her presence, just continued splitting a log after log, the pile of firewood growing steadily. She went back inside, put coffee on to boil, fried bacon and made biscuits. When she came out again with a plate and cup, he had moved on to stacking the split wood against the side of the cabin. She set the food on the porch step and went back inside without a word. When she looked out later, the plate was empty, placed neatly back where she'd left it. This became their pattern over the following days. Samuel would appear at dawn, work silently on whatever task needed doing, mending the chicken coop, patching holes in the barn, replacing broken fence posts. Margaret would leave food for him, which he would eat alone, always returning the dishes cleaned. They did not speak. He slept somewhere out on the land, though she sometimes saw the glow of his campfire in the distance. On the 5th day, she found something on her porch when she went to leave his breakfast. A small wooden bowl, perfectly round and smooth, carved from a single piece of juniper. She ran her fingers over the surface, marveling at the skill that had shaped it. When she looked up, Samuel was watching her from across the yard. "For the food," he said, the first words between them in days. "It's beautiful," Margaret replied honestly. "You have a gift." Something flickered in his eyes, pain or memory or both. He turned away, back to his work. More gifts appeared over the following weeks. A ladle to match the bowl, wooden buttons to replace the broken ones on her coat, a comb carved with delicate flowers. Each was perfectly made, shaped by hands that understood wood's inner nature. Margaret began to leave her own offerings. A warmer blanket when the nights grew bitter, a pair of thick socks she'd knitted, a book of poetry she'd seen him glance at through the window. Winter deepened around them. The snow piled high, making travel to town impossible. They were alone in their strange dance of silence and small kindnesses. Sometimes Margaret would catch him standing still, staring at nothing, his hands clenched around whatever tool he held. In those moments, she recognized the battle he fought, the same one she faced in her own dark hours. One evening, a blizzard struck with unexpected fury. Margaret had already resigned herself to worry when the barn door burst open and Samuel stumbled in, half frozen, supporting himself on the mare's neck. She didn't think, just acted, pulling him toward the cabin as he resisted weakly. "Just the barn," he mumbled through numb lips. "Not the house, not right. You'll die out there," Margaret said firmly, and something in her tone must have reached him because he stopped fighting. She got him inside, pushed him into the chair by the stove. His clothes were soaked with snow, his hands blue with cold. Margaret bustled about, stoking the fire higher, heating water, finding dry clothes from Thomas's trunk. She turned her back while he changed, busying herself with making coffee laced with the whiskey she kept for medicinal purposes. When she turned around, he was dressed in her dead husband's clothes, looking uncomfortable but warmer. She handed him the coffee and he wrapped his hands around the mug gratefully. "Thank you," he said quietly. They sat in silence as the storm raged outside, the wind howling like all the ghosts of the territory come to call. The cabin creaked and groaned but held firm, as it had through many such storms. In the lamplight, with the fire crackling and coffee warming their bellies, the silence between them felt different, not empty, but full of possibility. "My mother," Samuel said suddenly, "would be laughing at us, two fools, dancing around each other like wary cats." "Are we?" Margaret asked. "Dancing?" He looked at her then, really looked at her the way he had that first day. "I don't know how to be around people anymore. I don't know how to be anything but angry." "I know," Margaret said simply, because she did know. The anger was easier than the grief, sharper and cleaner than the endless ache of loss. Samuel set down his mug, pulled something from his pocket. The silver bracelet caught the firelight as he turned it in his hands. "This was hers, Nile." It means wind in our language. She was like that, wild and free and impossible to hold. His voice roughened. "I failed her. You were one man against many. You did what you could." "It wasn't enough. It never is." Margaret repeated the words she'd said before. "I was in town when they came, trading for supplies. By the time I got back..." She stopped, unable to finish. "We tell ourselves stories. If only I'd been there. If only I'd been faster, stronger, smarter. But the dead don't care about our if-onlys." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then, "No, they don't." The storm continued through the night. They dozed in their chairs by the fire, neither willing to claim a bed, this strange intimacy too fragile to push further. When morning came and the blizzard had passed, Samuel rose to leave. At the door, he paused. "I'll bring more wood. The storm took some shingles off your roof too. I'll fix them." Margaret nodded. As he stepped out into the bright snow-reflected light, she called after him, "You could use the barn, for your work, for shelter. It's warm enough with the animals, and there's hay for bedding." He looked back at her, something almost like a smile touching the corners of his mouth. My mother always said I was too proud for my own good. Pride's a cold bedfellow. Margaret replied. This time he did smile. Just barely. That sounds like something she would say. He moved his few possessions into the barn that day. And if their dance continued, at least now they danced a little closer, circling each other in the small space of the homestead. Two wounded souls learning to share their silence. The half-carved wooden horse sat on Margaret's mantel now, next to the photograph of her lost family. Sometimes she caught Samuel looking at it, his hands twitching as if they remembered the work left undone, but he never touched it, never spoke of finishing what he'd started. Some things, they both understood, were better left incomplete, monuments to moments when the world stopped making sense. The winter months settled over them like a heavy blanket, muffling the world in white silence. Each morning, Margaret would find Samuel's footprints in the fresh snow, leading from the barn to wherever his work took him that day. He had taken her suggestion about the barn, making himself a corner with hay bales and the old horse blankets, though she noticed he always positioned himself where he could see both doors. Their routine evolved slowly, like ice forming on still water. Samuel would appear at dawn to tend the horses and milk the cow. Margaret would have breakfast ready. Nothing fancy, just biscuits and gravy, sometimes eggs when the hens were laying. He began taking his meals in the kitchen, sitting across from her at the small wooden table Thomas had built their first year on the homestead. They ate in silence mostly, but it was a different kind of silence than either had known in their solitude. It was the quiet of two people learning to exist in the same space without disturbing each other's ghosts. One evening in late January, Margaret was struggling to thread a needle by lamplight, squinting at the eye that seemed to dance away from her efforts, without a word. Samuel reached across the table and took the needle and thread from her hands. His fingers, so large and roughened by work, managed the delicate task with ease. He handed it back to her and returned to carving a piece of cedar, as if such small kindnesses were nothing remarkable. "My eyes aren't what they used to be," Margaret said, surprising herself by speaking. "The lamp oil is low," Samuel replied. "Makes the light flicker. I'll refill it tomorrow." It was the longest exchange they'd had in weeks, and somehow it opened a door between them. Not wide, not yet, but enough to let a little warmth through. The next morning, Margaret found a pair of wooden knitting needles on her chair, polished smooth as glass. That evening, Samuel discovered a new shirt folded on his hay bales, sewn from fabric she'd been saving for no particular purpose. February brought blizzards that trapped them indoors for days at a time. Samuel took to working on his carvings in the kitchen, the wood shavings collecting at his feet like curved snowflakes. Margaret would sit across from him with her mending or knitting, the click of her needles keeping rhythm with the whisper of his knife through wood. "What are you making?" she asked one afternoon as he worked on a large piece of pine. He held it up, the beginning of what looked like a box, with dovetailed corners so precise they seemed to grow together rather than being joined. "Storage chest, for grain. The mice got into the sacks again." "Clever," she said, and meant it. Everything he made had a purpose, a function. Beauty seemed to happen by accident, in the graceful curve of a handle or the way he matched the wood grain. "My father taught me," Samuel said after a moment. "Before—" he trailed off, but Margaret understood. "Before the world changed, before everything broke. Thomas was good with his hands too," she offered. "Built most of this place himself. I helped where I could, but he had the vision for it." "It's well made," Samuel agreed, looking around the cabin with an appraising eye. "The joints are tight. It will stand a long time." Longer than the man who built it, Margaret thought but didn't say. Some truths didn't need speaking aloud. One night, the wind died completely, leaving a silence so profound it woke them both. Margaret heard Samuel moving in the barn, restless. She pulled on her coat and stepped outside, the cold sharp enough to steal her breath. The stars blazed overhead, countless and indifferent. Samuel stood by the corral fence, looking up at the sky. She joined him, leaving space between them, both watching the eternal dance of lights above. On nights like this, he said quietly, my sister would make up stories about the stars, said they were holes in the sky where the spirits looked through to watch over us. James used to think they were lanterns. Margaret replied, carried by angels to light God's way home. They stood there sharing the weight of memory until the cold drove them back to their separate shelters. But something had shifted between them, some recognition that their griefs, while different, rhymed in the same key. March arrived with the promise of spring. Though snow still covered the ground, Samuel had repaired everything that could be fixed around the homestead and built several pieces of furniture besides. The cabin was tighter and warmer than it had been in years. Margaret's larder was well stocked with the game he hunted and the vegetables they'd preserved together. One morning, she found him in the barn, packing his few belongings. The passes will clear soon, he said without looking at her. I should go. Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. She'd known this day would come, had told herself she was prepared for it. Where will you go? He shrugged, a gesture that tried to seem careless and failed. South, maybe, Mexico, somewhere they don't know my face. Running from the law? From everything. He finally looked at her, and she saw the war in his eyes. This wasn't supposed to. I stayed too long. Did you? Margaret kept her voice steady. Seems to me you stayed just long enough to fix what needed fixing. Your roof doesn't need me anymore. No, she agreed. It doesn't. They stood there in the barn that smelled of hay and horses and winter's end, neither saying what needed to be said. Finally. Samuel turned back to his packing. Margaret returned to the house, moving through her morning chores mechanically. She made breakfast for two out of habit, then sat staring at the empty chair across from her. The half-carved horse on the mantel watched her with its unfinished eyes. When she heard the barn door open, she didn't look up. Let him go, she told herself. It's better this way, cleaner. She'd survived alone before, she would again. But the footsteps came to the porch, hesitated. Then the door opened. Samuel stood there, his pack at his feet, something like confusion on his face. I got to the property line, he said. The paint mare won't go further, just plants her feet and won't budge. Despite everything, Margaret felt a smile tug at her mouth. Smart horse. She's never refused before, always ready to run when I am. Maybe she's tired of running. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. Then he set down his pack and took his usual chair. Margaret poured him coffee without comment, and they sat there as the morning sun climbed higher, painting the snow-covered world in shades of gold and blue. I don't know how to stay, he said finally. I only know how to leave. I don't know how to let anyone stay. Margaret admitted. I only know how to be alone. We're a fine pair, Samuel said with a bitter laugh. Your mother thought so. That silenced him. He stared into his coffee as if it might hold answers. She talked about you sometimes. The white woman who lived alone, who didn't run when the others did, said you were tough as mesquite root. She talked about you too, said you had artist's hands and a warrior's heart. She was wrong about the heart. Anyway, warriors protect what they love. You tried. Trying doesn't bring them back. No, Margaret said softly. But maybe it's enough to just keep trying, to wake up each day and try again. Samuel lifted his head, met her eyes. Is that what you do? Every morning, she confessed. Some days are harder than others. But I get up, I work, I eat, I go on. Alone. Yes. Does it get easier? Margaret considered lying, offering comfort, but they were past pretty lies. No, just more familiar. Samuel nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd suspected. He stood, went to the window, looked out at the land spreading white and endless. If I stay, he began, then stopped. If you stay, Margaret prompted. I can't promise anything. Can't promise I won't leave tomorrow or next week or next month. Can't promise I'll be good company or that I'll ever be whole again. I'm not asking for promises. What are you asking for? Margaret thought about it, tried to find words for the fragile thing growing between them. Just this, she said finally. Someone to share the silence. Someone who understands that some wounds don't heal, they just scar over. Someone to help with the work and sit by the fire when the day is done. That's all. That's everything, she corrected. For people like us. Samuel turned from the window, and she saw something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not hope exactly, but the possibility of it. The mare really won't budge, he said. Stubborn creature. Must take after her rider. That earned her almost a smile. I'll need to expand the barn workspace. If I'm staying, taking on furniture work for trade, maybe these hands need to keep busy. I've been thinking of adding a room, Margaret said carefully, for storage, or whatever's needed. They looked at each other across the kitchen that had become their shared space, both understanding what wasn't being said. Not yet. The silence agreed, but maybe someday. Samuel unpacked his few belongings and returned them to the barn. That evening, they sat by the fire as they had taken to doing, Margaret with her knitting and Samuel with his carving. The half-finished horse still watched from the mantel. But now it seemed less like an ending and more like a promise that some things, given time, might yet be completed. Outside, the paint mare whinnied softly in the corral, settled for the night. The wind had picked up again, but the cabin was warm and tight against it. Two people sat in comfortable silence, sharing the small circle of lamplight, learning the shape of a life that wasn't quite solitude anymore. When Margaret finally bid Samuel good night and he made his way to the barn, she paused at her bedroom door. Thank you, she called softly. For staying. Thank the mare, he replied. But she heard something in his voice that might have been relief. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Margaret slept without dreams of empty rooms and echoing silence. In the barn, Samuel lay in his hay bale bed, listening to the horses breathe and the settling of old wood, and thought that maybe, just maybe, his mother had been wiser than he'd known. Spring would come soon, with its thaw and mud and new growth. They would face it together, these two damaged souls, learning day by day how to build something from the ruins of before. Not love, not yet. That was too large a word for what grew between them, but connection, understanding, the simple comfort of not being alone in their grief. It was, as Ayanna had hoped, a beginning. Spring came late that year, with false starts of warmth followed by sudden freezes that killed the early blooms. By April, the snow had finally retreated to the high places, leaving the earth muddy and raw. Samuel and Margaret worked side by side preparing the garden plot, their movements synchronized by months of learning each other's rhythms. It was on a mild Tuesday that trouble first showed itself. Margaret had ridden into Cedar Ridge for supplies, leaving Samuel to work on a rocking chair commissioned by the schoolteacher. The town was busier than usual. Men gathered in knots outside the mercantile, their voices carrying that particular pitch of righteous anger. 3 families hit last month alone, she heard Josiah Wheeler saying. Apache's getting bolder since the army pulled back. Margaret kept her head down, focusing on her list. Salt pork, flour, coffee, thread, simple things for a simple life. But as she loaded her purchases, she felt eyes on her back. Mrs. Sullivan. The voice belonged to Catherine Morrison, the banker's wife. We haven't seen you in town much this winter. The snow was deep. Margaret replied evenly. Yes, I'm sure that was it. Catherine's smile was sharp as glass. Nothing to do with that Indian you've taken in. Margaret's hand stilled on the reins. I've hired a man to help with repairs. That's all. An Apache man. The same savages who killed your husband? Catherine's voice rose, ensuring the other women nearby could hear. Have you no shame? Have you no manners? Margaret countered, surprising herself with the heat in her voice. Or is gossip the only currency you trade in these days? She climbed onto her wagon before Catherine could respond, but she heard the whispers following her out of town. By the time she reached home, her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from anger. Samuel took one look at her face and set down his tools. What happened? Nothing. Town gossip. It doesn't matter. But it did matter. And they both knew it. That night after supper, Samuel spoke into their comfortable silence. I should go. This will only get worse. You think I care what Catherine Morrison says? What any of them say? You should care. These are your people. Margaret's laugh was bitter. My people? The same ones who whispered I must have done something to deserve losing my family? Who offered condolences with one breath and asked about selling my land with the next? She shook her head. They stopped being my people long ago. 3 days later, the first group came. 5 men, whiskey bold and mean with it, rode up as the sun was setting. Margaret recognized Jake Morrison among them, Catherine's eldest son. Evening, Mrs. Sullivan, Jake called out, his words slightly slurred. Come to check on your welfare. Margaret stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand but pointed down. I'm well enough. You can go. Now that's not neighborly. Jake dismounted, swaying slightly. Heard you got yourself a buck living here. That ain't proper for a white woman. What's not proper is you bringing liquor and trouble to my door. Margaret replied. Get back on your horse and go home. Jake, you're drunk. Not so drunk I can't see what's what. He took a step forward. Where is he? The Apache? Samuel emerged from the barn then, moving with that fluid silence that was part of him. He held no weapon, but his presence changed the air, made it tight and dangerous. There he is, one of the other men spat, bold as brass. He works for me, Margaret said firmly. Has all winter, good honest work, which is more than I can say for men who ride around drunk looking for trouble. Work? Jake laughed ugly. That what they're calling it now? The insult hung in the air like smoke. Margaret felt Samuel tense beside her, but he didn't move, didn't speak. His control was iron, learned from surviving in a world that wanted him dead. Get off my land, Margaret said, her voice cold as winter wind. All of you, now! Or what, you'll shoot us? Jake spread his arms wide, playing to his audience. For suggesting you shouldn't bed down with savages? The rifle was in Margaret's hands and aimed before she consciously decided to raise it. Or I'll shoot you for trespassing. Sheriff knows I'm within my rights. You wouldn't dare. The shot split the air, sending Jake's hat spinning into the dirt. The horses danced and whinnied. Jake's face went white, then red. That's one, Margaret said calmly, already levering another round. I've got 5 more, and I'm a better shot than you might think. Thomas made sure of that. The mention of her dead husband seemed to penetrate their whiskey fog. They knew Thomas Sullivan's reputation, knew he'd taught his wife to defend herself. Jake retrieved his hat with shaking hands, the bullet hole clean through the crown. This ain't over, he said as he mounted. You can't live like this. It ain't natural. It ain't right. What's not right is good-for-nothing drunks threatening a widow. Margaret replied. Remember that when you're explaining to your mother how you got that hole in your hat? They rode off in a cloud of dust and curses. Margaret lowered the rifle, her arms suddenly trembling. Samuel gently took it from her hands. You shouldn't have done that, he said quietly. They had no right? They'll be back, with more men, sober men. He looked toward town, his face grim. This is what I bring you. Trouble and shame. No. Margaret grabbed his arm as he turned away. This is what small minds and smaller hearts bring. Don't you dare take their poison into yourself. They stood there in the gathering darkness, her pale hand on his sun-darkened arm, both breathing hard from more than the confrontation. Then Samuel did something that surprised them both. He covered her hand with his own. You're a dangerous woman, Margaret Sullivan. I'm a woman who's tired of being told how to grieve, who to help, how to live. She looked up at him, fierce and determined. If they want a fight, they'll have one. But the fight, when it came, wasn't what either expected. 2 nights later, Margaret woke to the smell of smoke and the orange glow of fire. She ran outside to find the hayrick ablaze, flames reaching toward the barn where Samuel slept. Samuel! She ran barefoot across the yard, coughing in the thick smoke. The horses were screaming, kicking at their stalls. She threw open the barn door just as Samuel emerged, leading both horses. Together they fought the fire, hauling bucket after bucket from the well, beating at the flames with wet blankets. By dawn, they'd saved the barn but lost half their winter hay supply. They stood looking at the smoldering remains, clothes singed and faces blackened with soot. Could have been worse, Samuel said finally. They could have burned the barn itself, or the house. A warning, Margaret agreed. Next time. There won't be a next time. His voice was flat, decided. I'm leaving today. No. Margaret? No. She turned to face him fully. You think I don't know what this is? You think I haven't counted the cost? She gestured at the burned hay. This is nothing. I've lost everything that mattered. My husband, my child, my heart. You think I care about hay? About what the town thinks? You should care. This is your home. An empty house isn't a home. It's just walls and a roof. She stepped closer, close enough to see the soot in the lines of his face. You changed that. Your presence, your work, your silence that understands my silence. That's worth more than their approval. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. They won't stop. It will get worse. Then we'll face it worse together. She managed a tired smile. Besides, you can't leave. That stubborn mare of yours won't let you. He almost smiled at that. You're as stubborn as she is. Stubborner? Ask anyone in town. They spent the day cleaning up, salvaging what they could. Word must have spread because no one came from town to help, though Margaret saw riders on the ridge watching. Let them watch, she thought. Let them see that we don't break so easily. That evening, exhausted and grimy, they sat on the porch steps sharing water from the same cup. The spring air was soft, carrying the scent of new growth and possibility despite the acrid smell of burned hay. My mother would have liked you, Samuel said suddenly. She always said the strongest trees grow in the hardest ground. She sounds wise. She was wise and stubborn and too willing to hope. He looked at Margaret sideways. She would have fought them too, probably with more than just a rifle. What would she have done? For the first time since she'd known him, Samuel truly smiled. It transformed his face, showing the man he might have been in a kinder world. Probably invited them for dinner, fed them until they were too full to hate. That was her way, kill them with kindness. Did it work? Sometimes, sometimes not. The smile faded but didn't disappear entirely. But she never stopped trying. They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to appear. The burned hayrick was an ugly scar on the land, but it would heal. Everything healed, given time and care. I'm staying, Samuel said quietly. Not because I can't leave, but because leaving would be the easy choice. And I'm tired of easy choices. Margaret felt something ease in her chest. A knot she hadn't realized was there. Good, because I have plans for expanding that garden, and I'll need help. Just the garden? She looked at him. This complicated man who'd carved himself a place in her life as surely as he carved beauty from wood. We'll start with the garden, see what grows. He nodded, understanding as always what lived in the spaces between words. They sat together until full dark. Two people who'd chosen the hard path of staying, of standing against the tide of hate and judgment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The town wouldn't give up easily. But tonight, they had this, the quiet evening, the promise of spring, and the strange, fragile hope growing between them like a green shoot through burned earth. The half-carved horse still waited on the mantel, but Samuel had started working on it again in the evenings. Not to finish it. Some things should remain incomplete, but to add small details, tiny improvements, like their life together. It was becoming something new while honoring what had been before. The weeks after the fire passed in uneasy quiet. No more night riders came, but Margaret felt the weight of watching eyes whenever she went to town. Samuel worked closer to the house now, never straying far, his rifle always within reach. They were under siege, though no shots had been fired since that night with Jake Morrison. It was late May when the storm finally broke, not from without, But from within, Margaret had spent the day preserving early berries, the kitchen sweet with the smell of cooking fruit. Samuel had been quieter than usual, his movements sharp and restless as he repaired harnesses in the barn. She'd learned to read his moods like weather signs, and today promised thunder. As evening fell, she found him sitting by the cold fire pit outside, staring at something in his hands. The silver bracelet caught the dying light, and beside it, the half-carved horse. "Supper's ready?" she called softly. He didn't move. "I was thinking of burning them." Margaret approached slowly, the way she would a spooked horse. "Why?" "Because I can't," his voice cracked. "Every time I look at them, I see her face, hear her laugh, feel the weight of my failure." She sat beside him on the log bench, careful not to touch. "Tell me about her." "I've told you." "No. You've told me how she died. Tell me how she lived." Samuel was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "She loved mornings, would wake before everyone, slip out to watch the sun rise. Said each day was a new painting the Creator made just for us." His thumb traced the bracelet's pattern. "She was learning silver work from our uncle. This was her third try. See how the edges aren't quite even, but she was so proud." "How old was she?" 15 summers. Just starting to notice boys, though she pretended not to. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. There was this young man, Joseph Yazzie, who would find excuses to ride by our camp. Neil would ignore him completely while braiding her hair extra careful. Margaret smiled at the image. "She sounds wonderful." She was everything good in the world. The smile vanished. And they destroyed her for sport. Because they could, because no one would stop them. You tried to stop them. I failed. He stood abruptly, pacing to the fire pit. "I should burn these. Cut the last ties. Stop pretending she's somehow still here in these objects." "Is that what you think? That you're keeping her alive through things?" Samuel whirled on her, eyes blazing. "What else do I have? Tell me." Margaret Sullivan. "What else remains of the people we love when they're gone? Memories that cut like knives? Dreams that wake us screaming?" "What?" Margaret stood too, matching his intensity. "You have the love itself, the way she shaped you, every gentle thing you do, every beautiful piece you create. That's her, living on in your hands." "These hands." He held them up, shaking. "These hands that couldn't save her. These hands that tried, that killed 2 men trying. That would have killed more if you could have." She stepped closer. "These hands that create instead of destroy now. You think that doesn't honor her? It doesn't bring her back." "No," Margaret agreed quietly. "Nothing brings them back. I know, God, how I know." The fight went out of him suddenly. He sank back onto the bench, the precious objects falling from nerveless fingers. Margaret retrieved them carefully, sitting beside him again. "Sometimes," she said, "I wake up, and for just a moment, I forget. I think I'll hear James chattering in the kitchen, or feel Thomas stirring beside me, and then I remember, and it's like losing them all over again." Samuel nodded, understanding too well. "But other times," she continued, "I'll see something. A bird James would have loved, a sunset Thomas would have admired, and instead of pain, I feel grateful that I got to know them, that they were mine, even for such a short time." "When does that happen? The grateful instead of the pain?" "I don't know. It sneaks up on you. One day you realize you've gone an hour without that crushing weight. Then a day, then—" She shrugged. "You never stop missing them, but you learn to carry it different." They sat quietly as darkness gathered. The first fireflies of summer began their ancient dance, points of light in the gloom. Samuel picked up the wooden horse, turning it in his hands. "She would have been 18 now," he said softly. "Maybe married to Joseph Yazzie. Maybe with a baby of her own. Maybe? I dream about her sometimes. Different dreams now. Not the bad ones. She's older in them, showing me grandchildren, laughing at my gray hair." His voice broke. "How can I dream of grandchildren who will never exist?" Margaret took his hand then, lacing their fingers together. His skin was rough with calluses, warm with life. Because love doesn't understand death. It just goes on hoping, even when hope makes no sense. He gripped her hand like a lifeline. I'm so tired of carrying this alone. Then don't let me help carry it. I've got strong shoulders. Samuel laughed, short and sharp and wet. You barely come up to my shoulder. Size isn't everything. Ask that stubborn mare of yours. That earned a real smile, fleeting but genuine. They sat holding hands as the night deepened, neither speaking of the intimacy. The line crossed. When the air grew chill, Margaret stood. Come inside. Supper's gone cold, but we can warm it. Samuel followed her in, still carrying the bracelet and horse. Instead of returning them to his pocket, he set them on the kitchen table between them as they ate reheated stew. Neil's presence seemed to fill the room, but it wasn't the sharp pain of before, more like a gentle sadness, bearable in its softness. Your mother, Margaret said suddenly. Ayanna, did she know about Neil when she came here? Of course. It was why she came. She thought, he paused, considering. She thought we could help each other heal. Two people who understood loss. Was she right? Samuel looked at her across the table. This white woman who'd taken him in despite everything, who faced down men with guns rather than let prejudice drive him away, who held his hand while he grieved another woman, a sister whose death had broken something fundamental in him. I don't know about healing, he said honestly, but you make the hurting quieter. You do the same for me. They finished eating in comfortable silence. When Margaret rose to clear the dishes, Samuel caught her wrist gently. That night, with Niall, I've never told anyone the whole truth. Margaret sank back into her chair, waiting. I could have run when they first came to the camp, could have slipped away, gathered help, but I saw them notice her, saw their eyes. He swallowed hard. I knew what they intended, so I attacked first, tried to draw them off. It worked, partly. They focused on me, beat me down, but not all of them. Not enough of them? Samuel, I could hear her crying for me, calling my name, and I couldn't move, couldn't. His voice shattered. She died, thinking I abandoned her. No. Margaret moved around the table, knelt beside his chair. She died, knowing her brother loved her enough to fight impossible odds, to nearly die trying to save her. It wasn't enough. It was everything. You gave everything you had. She gripped his hands, forced him to meet her eyes. Listen to me. I know the weight of survival. I know how it feels to be the one left breathing when everyone you love is gone. But you didn't choose to survive. You fought until you couldn't fight anymore. You don't understand. I was in town. The words came out raw, torn from someplace deep. The day my family died, I was in town flirting with Frank Morrison at the Mercantile, laughing at his stupid jokes, enjoying the attention while Thomas was home with James. While they were dying, I was batting my eyelashes at another man. Samuel's hands turned in hers, holding now instead of being held. Margaret, I could have been there, should have been there, but I wanted ribbons for a new dress, wanted to feel pretty and noticed. My vanity cost me everything. The tears came then, hot and bitter. So don't tell me I don't understand. At least you were fighting. At least you tried. I was shopping for ribbons. They clung to each other then. Two people drowning in different oceans of guilt but finding the same shore. Samuel pulled her up, into his arms, and they stood there in the kitchen, holding each other while years of carefully controlled grief broke free. When the storm passed, they were both exhausted. Margaret's face was blotched and swollen. Samuel's eyes were red-rimmed. But something had shifted. Some festering wound finally drained. We're a pair of fools, Samuel said hoarsely. The worst kind. Margaret agreed. The ones who survived. They separated slowly, almost shyly, aware that comfort had become something else in those desperate moments. Margaret busied herself making tea while Samuel built up the fire. When they sat again, it was side by side on the bench near the hearth, shoulders touching. She would have liked you, Samuel said quietly. Neil would have pestered you to teach her your embroidery stitches. She always wanted to learn everything. James would have loved your carvings, probably would have begged you to teach him. Margaret smiled through fresh tears. He had no patience for it, but he would have tried so hard. They talked through the night, sharing memories they'd held too tight to speak before. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, they were still there. Voices hoarse but hearts lighter. The bracelet lay on the mantel now, next to the photograph of Margaret's family. The wooden horse sat beside it, still unfinished but no longer abandoned. They were not shrines to the dead, but acknowledgments of love that transcended death. "Thank you," Samuel said as the first birds began their morning songs. "For what? For not letting me burn them. For understanding. For—" He gestured helplessly at the space between them. The connection that had no easy name. Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder, felt him tense, then slowly relax. "Thank you for staying, for trusting me with her memory, for making this empty house feel less empty." They dozed there as the sun climbed. Two wounded souls who'd found in each other not healing. That would take more time than they'd yet had, but the promise of it, the beginning of something that might, with patience and courage, grow into more than shared sorrow. Outside, Samuel's paint mare whinnied a greeting to the new day. And in the kitchen, surrounded by the memories of those they'd lost and the tentative hope of what they might build together, Margaret and Samuel faced another morning, not alone this time, but together in their imperfect, necessary way. June arrived with its scorching days and thunderstorms that rolled across the plains like nature's own artillery. Margaret and Samuel had fallen into deeper rhythms, their connection strengthened by that night of shared grief. They worked the garden together in the cool mornings, their hands sometimes brushing as they reached for the same tool, neither pulling away anymore. It was during one of these peaceful mornings that Sheriff William Hartley arrived with 2 deputies and a warrant. "Mrs. Sullivan," the sheriff said, not quite meeting her eyes. He'd known Thomas, had even come to the funeral. "I'm sorry about this." Margaret set down her hoe carefully, aware of Samuel going very still beside her. "What's this about, William?" "Got a warrant here for Samuel Sosi, murder of 2 soldiers at Fort Buchanan. 3 years past." "Those men were attacking his sister," Margaret said evenly. "He was defending." "That's for a judge to decide, ma'am." Hartley shifted uncomfortably. "I've got my orders. He needs to come peaceful-like." Samuel stepped forward, and Margaret saw the resignation in his face, the return of that deadness in his eyes. "I'll come." "No." Margaret moved between them. "William, you know this isn't right. You know what happened out there, what those soldiers were doing to Apache families." "I know what the paper says, Margaret, and the paper says he killed 2 army men." The sheriff's hand rested on his pistol. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "Harder?" Margaret's voice rose. "You're arresting a man for protecting his sister from assault. How much harder can it be?" "Step aside, ma'am." "Margaret." Samuel's voice was quiet behind her. "Don't. It's not worth—" "You're worth it," she said fiercely, not turning around. "Sheriff, what happens if you take him? We both know he won't make it to trial. Some accident on the road, or vigilante justice in the jail." "I run a clean jail," Hartley protested, but his eyes flickered. "Like you run a clean town, where men can burn a widow's property without consequence?" Margaret felt a cold clarity settling over her. "Where's your warrant for Jake Morrison and his friends?" "That's different." "How? Because they're white?" The deputies shifted restlessly. One of them, a young man named Curtis, spoke up. "Sheriff, maybe we could—" "Quiet, Curtis." Hartley's face had gone red. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm asking you one last time. Step aside." Margaret looked at the 3 men, saw the mixture of duty and discomfort in their faces. Good men, probably, who'd convince themselves later they were just following orders, who'd feel bad when they heard Samuel had been lynched, but not bad enough to have prevented it. "No," she said simply. "Then you're under arrest too, for obstruction." So be it. What happened next occurred so fast Margaret could barely process it. Samuel moved, pulling her behind him as Hartley drew his gun. The shot was impossibly loud in the morning air. Samuel grunted, spun, and fell against her. Blood bloomed across his shirt like a terrible flower. "No!" Margaret caught him as he fell, his weight driving them both to their knees. "No, no, no! Damn it! Hartley!" Curtis rushed forward. "He wasn't armed! He moved sudden! I thought—" The sheriff's face had gone pale. "I didn't mean— Get Doc Morrison." Curtis ordered the other deputy. "Now!" But Margaret wasn't listening. She pressed her hands against the wound in Samuel's side, trying to stem the flow of blood. His face was gray, eyes glazed with shock. "Stay with me," she commanded. "You stay with me, Samuel Sosi." "Margaret?" His voice was thin, breathless. "Should have burned them. Don't you dare leave me." She was crying. She realized, tears mixing with the blood on her hands. "I can't do this alone anymore. I can't." Samuel's hand found hers, weak but present. "Not alone." The next hour was a blur. Doc Morrison, no relation to Jake, thank God, arrived and worked with steady hands to stop the bleeding. They moved Samuel inside, onto the bed Margaret hadn't slept in since Thomas died. She held Samuel's hand through it all, whispering prayers she hadn't said in years, promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "Bullet went clean through," Doc Morrison finally said, washing his hands in the basin. "Missed the vital organs, but he's lost a lot of blood. Next day or two will tell." Sheriff Hartley stood in the doorway, hat in hands. "Margaret, Get out!" Her voice was ice. "Get out of my house before I find my rifle. The warrant. You shot an unarmed man on my property." She turned to face him, and something in her expression made him step back. "You want to arrest him. You'll have to go through me, and unlike Samuel, I'll be armed." Hartley fled, followed by his deputies. Doc Morrison lingered, checking Samuel's bandages one more time. "He's strong," the doctor said quietly. "And he's got reason to fight. That helps." After he left, Margaret pulled a chair next to the bed. Samuel drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering in Apache and English. She bathed his fevered face, changed his bandages, forced water between his cracked lips. On the second night, his fever spiked. He thrashed, calling for Neil, for his mother, sometimes for Margaret. She climbed onto the bed beside him, holding him still, whispering that he was safe, that she was there, that he couldn't leave her. "Please," she found herself saying. "I know I have no right to ask. I know we're just two broken people trying to make sense of loss, but I need you to stay. I need—" She pressed her face against his burning shoulder. "I love you. God help me. I don't know when it happened, but I do, so you have to fight." Whether he heard her or not, she couldn't say. But near dawn, the fever broke. Samuel's breathing eased, and when his eyes opened, they were clear. "Margaret?" His voice was barely a whisper. "I'm here." She smoothed his hair back from his damp forehead. "I'm right here." "The sheriff?" "Gone. They're all gone." She helped him sip water. "Doc Morrison says you'll heal clean if you rest." Samuel studied her face, taking in her exhaustion, her tears. "You stayed." "Where else would I go?" She tried for lightness, failed. "This is my home. You're—" She stopped, suddenly shy. "What am I?" His hand found hers, despite his weakness. Margaret thought of all the things he'd become. Her companion, her friend, her reason for getting up when the darkness pressed too close. "You're my person," she said finally. "The one who understands, who makes the empty places less empty." "Just that?" She saw something in his eyes then, a hope that matched her own. "What else would you want to be?" "Yours," he said simply. "If you'll have me, broken pieces and all." Margaret's tears came fresh then, But they were different tears. Only if you'll have mine. Samuel squeezed her hand weakly. Deal. They were quiet then, hands clasped, watching the morning light grow stronger. Outside, they could hear horses approaching, probably the sheriff returning with reinforcements. Margaret stood, reaching for the rifle. What are you doing? Samuel tried to sit up, gasped at the pain. What I should have done from the start. She checked the rifle's load, calm now, with purpose. Protecting what's mine. Margaret, you can't fight the whole town. Watch me. She moved to the window, saw Hartley and 6 men dismounting. Though I won't have to, just need to make it cost more than they're willing to pay. She stepped onto the porch, rifle ready. The men stopped at the property line, suddenly cautious. That's far enough. William, she called. Now, Margaret, be reasonable. Her shot kicked up dust at his feet. That's one. You're making this worse, Hartley shouted. He's got to answer for what he done. He answered already, with 3 years of grief, with trying to build something good from the ashes, with bleeding on my land for the crime of existing while Apache. She worked the lever, chambered another round. You want to take him, you'll have to kill me first. And we both know Thomas taught me well. I'll take at least 3 of you with me. The men muttered among themselves. She heard one say, this ain't worth dying for. Curtis, the young deputy, stepped forward. Mrs. Sullivan, what if we just forgot this happened? Sheriff made a mistake shooting an unarmed man. Warrant could get lost in the paperwork. Hartley started to protest, but Curtis cut him off. You want to explain to the federal marshal how you shot a man who wasn't resisting? How you turned a simple arrest into a bloodbath? Margaret kept the rifle steady. And then what? You come back next week? Next month? No, ma'am, Curtis said firmly. Man's paid enough. Seems to me, long as he stays out of trouble, might be nobody needs to remember he's here. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't justice. But it was survival. And sometimes that had to be enough. I'll hold you to that. Curtis? Margaret said, all of you, this man is under my protection. Anyone who comes for him comes for me. One by one, the men mounted and rode away. Hartley went last, his face a mixture of relief and wounded pride. Margaret stayed on the porch until they were dust on the horizon. Then her legs gave out and she sat hard on the steps, rifle clattering beside her. She was still there when Samuel appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily on the frame, pale but upright. You shouldn't be up, she said without turning. You shouldn't have done that. He made his way to her, lowering himself carefully to sit beside her. Risked everything. No, Margaret corrected. I risked nothing. Without you, it's just an empty house on empty land. With you, she looked at him, this man who'd carved his way into her heart as surely as he shaped wood. With you, it's home. Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then, the Apache have a word, Goya. It means one's home, but it also means one's heart. Same word for both. Smart people, the Apache. Yes. He took her hand, brought it to his lips. Margaret Sullivan, you are my Goya, my home and my heart both. She leaned into him carefully, mindful of his wound. And you're mine. God help us both. They sat there as the morning warmed around them. 2 people who'd found in each other not just solace, but strength. The future remained uncertain. The town's prejudice wouldn't vanish, and Samuel would always carry the warrant's shadow. But for now, they had this, a porch, a view of land that would grow green again, and the fierce, necessary love of 2 hearts that refused to surrender. Inside the house, the silver bracelet caught the light, and the half-carved horse stood witness to promises made and kept, to the possibility that broken things might indeed be made whole again, or at least whole enough to stand against whatever storms might come. The decision to leave came in late July, after Samuel's wound had healed to a pink scar and the summer heat had baked the land hard as stone. They'd spoken of it in quiet moments, the knowledge that Cedar Ridge would never let them be, that safety was an illusion that could shatter with any shift in the political wind. There's a place, Samuel said one evening as they sat watching the sunset, North, in the mountains, where my mother's people sometimes winter, hidden valleys, fresh water, game enough to sustain us. Margaret looked at the cabin Thomas had built, the graves on the hill. I've never left this place, not since... I know. His hand covered hers. But sometimes staying is its own kind of leaving, dying slow instead of living. She thought of the faces in town, cold and closed, of Sheriff Hartley's guilty eyes and Jake Morrison's sneer, of a future spent looking over their shoulders, waiting for the next fire, the next warrant, the next bullet. When? She asked simply. New moon. 5 days. We take only what we need. They prepared quietly, efficiently. Margaret packed her mother's quilt, the photograph of Thomas and James, a few precious books. Samuel readied the horses, repaired an old travois, selected tools and supplies with careful thought. On their last night, they visited the graves together. I'm not abandoning you, Margaret whispered to the 2 wooden crosses. I'm choosing to live. I hope you understand. They left before dawn, the cabin dark behind them. Margaret didn't look back. The journey north took 2 weeks through country that grew wilder with each passing day. They followed game trails and ancient paths Samuel remembered from childhood, climbing always higher into mountains that scraped the sky. The air grew thin and cold despite the summer season. On the 10th day, as they led the horses up a particularly treacherous stretch, Samuel suddenly stopped. Listen. Margaret heard nothing but wind. Then, voices, carried on the mountain air. Apache voices. My mother's brother, Samuel said, tension in every line. His band, I haven't seen them since. 3 riders appeared on the ridge above, moving with casual grace down the impossible terrain. The lead rider, an older man with Samuel's strong jaw, called out in Apache. Samuel answered, his voice formal. Careful. They spoke for several minutes while Margaret held the horses, feeling the weight of assessment from the other riders. Finally, the older man, Samuel's uncle, she assumed, turned his attention to her. He said something that made Samuel's jaw tighten. He asks why I bring a white woman to the sacred places. Samuel translated quietly. He says I shame my sister's memory. Margaret felt the words like a physical blow, but kept her back straight. What did you tell him? That you are my wife. That you saved my life. That... Samuel paused, then continued in Apache, his voice growing stronger. His uncle's expression didn't soften, but something shifted in it. He spoke again, gesturing at Margaret. He says you must prove yourself, that white women are weak, useless in the mountains. Samuel's hand found hers. I told him he's wrong. Then I'll show him, Margaret said. The testing began immediately. They were led to the band's camp, a collection of brush shelters in a hidden valley. The women watched with skeptical eyes as Margaret struggled with unfamiliar tasks, preparing food she didn't recognize, working hides with tools she'd never seen, keeping pace on brutal mountain trails. She failed more than she succeeded those first days. Her hands bled from the work, her body ached from the altitude and effort. But she got up each dawn and tried again, driven by the same stubborn will that had kept her alone on the homestead for 3 years. Slowly, incrementally, she learned. An elder woman named Alona, taking pity perhaps, showed her how to hold the scraping tool properly. A young mother demonstrated the right way to gather certain roots. Children began to giggle at her mistakes instead of staring in hostile silence. Samuel watched it all with worried eyes, torn between his people and the woman he'd chosen. At night in their small shelter, set apart from the others but accepted within the camp's boundaries, he held her while she tried not to cry from exhaustion and frustration. You don't have to do this, he whispered. We can leave. Find somewhere else. No. Her voice was fierce despite her fatigue. These are your people. This is your family. I won't be the reason you lose them again. The breakthrough came during a hunt. The men had gone after elk, leaving the camp nearly empty. Margaret was gathering firewood when she heard screaming, a child's terrified cry. She ran toward the sound, finding a boy of perhaps 6 cornered against a rock face by a mountain cat. She didn't think. The firewood in her arms became weapons, hurled at the cat's head. She placed herself between predator and child, shouting, making herself large. The cat, more irritated than truly hungry, decided the meal wasn't worth the trouble and melted back into the forest. The boy, Samuel's young cousin, she learned later, clung to her skirts, sobbing. She held him until his mother arrived, wild-eyed with fear. The woman looked between Margaret and her son, understanding immediately what had happened. That night, the boy's father presented Margaret with a knife. Speaking formally in Apache, Samuel translated, his voice thick with emotion. He says you have a warrior's heart, that his son lives because of your courage. You are welcome in this fire, this family. The camp's attitude shifted after that. The women included her in their work circles, teaching with patience instead of skepticism. The men nodded respectfully when she passed. Even Samuel's uncle unbent enough to show her how to set snares for small game. But it was during the first heavy snow that Margaret truly understood the price of their new life. The temperature plummeted, game grew scarce, and every calorie became precious. She watched children grow thin, saw elders give their portions to the young, felt her own body consuming itself to stay warm. This is the hard time, Alona told her as they huddled by the fire. Some winters, not everyone sees spring. Margaret thought of her warm cabin, the stocked larder, the safety of walls and roof. Then she looked at Samuel, saw how he'd come alive among his people despite the hardship, heard him laughing with his cousins as they repaired weapons. This was the price of his happiness, his belonging. She would pay it gladly. The crisis came in deep winter. Samuel went hunting with the other men, desperate to find game in the frozen wilderness. Days passed with no word. The women maintained the camp, rationing the meager supplies. Keeping the children's spirits up with stories and songs Margaret was beginning to understand. On the fourth night, as a blizzard raged outside the shelters, Margaret heard them returning, too few voices, moving too slowly. She rushed out into the storm with the other women, finding the hunting party dragging improvised sledges. Samuel wasn't among the walking. She found him on one of the sledges, unconscious, his lips blue with cold. The men spoke rapidly. Avalanche, trapped for hours. Barely dug him out in time. Margaret and the women dragged him to the warmest shelter, working frantically to raise his body temperature. Not like this, Margaret whispered as she held his frozen hands, breathing warm air on them. You don't get to leave me like this. Through the night she fought for him as he'd once fought for his sister, as she'd fought for him against the sheriff. She forced warm broth between his lips, wrapped him in every blanket they could spare, used her own body heat when that wasn't enough. I love you, she told him in the dark, in English and the Apache words she'd learned. Come back to me. Come back. Near dawn, his eyes opened. Margaret? His voice was a thread of sound. I'm here. You're safe. Tears froze on her cheeks. You're home, he managed a weak smile. You are my home. The storm passed. Samuel recovered slowly, tended by Margaret and the medicine woman, surrounded by family who'd reclaimed him. As spring touched the mountains with green, Margaret realized she'd survived her first winter with the band. More than survived. She'd found her place. You've changed, Samuel told her one evening as they sat watching the camp's children play. Her Apache was good enough now to understand their games, their jokes. We both have. She leaned into his warmth. Is that bad? No, you're stronger. Like the mountains have carved away everything unnecessary. He touched her face, tracing the new lines sun and wind had etched there. My uncle says you have an Apache heart in a white body. And what do you say? That you have Margaret's heart, brave and stubborn and beautiful. He kissed her gently. That I almost died twice to learn what living means. What does it mean? This, he said simply, gesturing at the camp. The children, the mountains painted gold by sunset, family, purpose, someone to share the hard times and the good. He smiled. A very stubborn woman who fights mountain cats and winter and death itself for the people she loves. Margaret smiled back, remembering the woman she'd been, alone in her cabin, dying slowly of grief and isolation. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone she'd known long ago. "No regrets?" Samuel asked. "About leaving everything behind?" She thought of the graves on the hill, of Thomas and James. They would always be part of her, always hurt. But the pain had softened, become bearable in the face of new purpose, new love, new family. "No regrets," she said firmly. "Only gratitude." As darkness fell and the camp settled for the night, Margaret helped prepare the evening meal, joking with the other women in a mixture of Apache and English. Samuel watched from across the fire, carving something new, a cradleboard, she realized. For the future, for hope, for the children who might yet be. The half-carved horse was finished now, standing in their shelter beside Niall's bracelet. Not perfect, but complete, like their lives, scarred and strange and thoroughly, beautifully whole. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Winter would come again. The outside world wouldn't forget forever. But tonight, surrounded by firelight and family, Margaret Sullivan, who was learning to think of herself by her Apache name, woman who stands before danger, was exactly where she belonged. Home. Spring came gently to the mountains that year, melting snow in silver streams that sang their way down to the valleys below. Margaret woke to the sound of birds and the warm weight of Samuel's arm across her waist. Through the shelter's opening, she could see the camp stirring to life, women tending fires, children chasing dogs, men preparing for the day's hunt. 2 years had passed since they'd fled the homestead. 2 years of learning, adapting, becoming. Her hands were brown from sun, calloused from work, steady with skills she'd never imagined needing. When she looked in the still water of the mountain pools, she barely recognized the woman looking back. "You're awake," Samuel murmured against her neck. "The baby's awake," she corrected, placing his hand on the gentle swell of her belly. "Been dancing since dawn." His hand spread protective over their child, and she felt him smile. A dancer like Aunt Neil, or a woodcarver like the father, or a fighter like the mother. They lay there in the quiet morning, a peace that would have seemed impossible that first desperate winter. The camp had accepted them fully now. Margaret had proved herself through seasons of hardship, through illness and lean times, through the fierce love she showed for Samuel and his family. "Margaret," young Rosita's voice called from outside. "The scouts are back." Margaret rose carefully, her center of balance still adjusting to pregnancy. Outside, she found the camp gathering around 3 riders who'd been gone for a week, checking on the world beyond their hidden valleys. Samuel's uncle, Joseph Birdsong, looked grave as he spoke. Margaret understood enough Apache now to follow most conversations, though the scouts spoke quickly, urgently. "Soldiers," Samuel translated quietly beside her. 2 days south, a full company. They're not following our trail, but they're close." Margaret finished. The camp would need to move deeper into the mountains, into the secret places even the army couldn't find. It meant harder living, less game, more danger from the elements. The elders debated through the day while the women began packing, efficient with long practice. That evening, as Margaret helped Alona prepare traveling food, the older woman studied her with knowing eyes. "The baby comes in 2 moons. Yes? Yes. Hard travel for one so close to her time." Alona's hands didn't pause in their work. "Perhaps you should go to the White Towns. Have the baby safe." Margaret's hands did pause. "This is my family now. Where you go, I go. Even unto death. Especially then. I've buried family before. I won't abandon another." Alona smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face. "You understand now what it means to be Apache. Not blood, choice. To choose the hard path because it's where your people walk." That night, the camp held council. Samuel spoke passionately about finding a more permanent solution, about the need for a place where they could live without running. Others argued for the old ways, for staying hidden, for outlasting their enemies as they always had. It was Joseph Birdsong who surprised everyone. "There is another way." he said slowly. "I have been thinking. The white woman." He nodded at Margaret. She had papers for her land, legal papers. If we could find such a place, claim it in the white man's way. Live on their terms, Samuel's cousin spat. Be farmers, tame Indians for their amusement. Live, Joseph corrected firmly. Our children grow up knowing only running. They forget the ceremonies, the proper ways. Better to have land that is ours by their law and our tradition than to die free in the mountains. The debate raged long into the night. Margaret listened, understanding that she was witnessing something profound, a people deciding how to survive in a world that wanted them gone. Finally, Samuel stood. My wife's father was a surveyor. She knows something of land law. Margaret, all eyes turned to her. She took a breath, stood despite her ungainly balance. There is land to the north, hard land that white settlers don't want, but there are streams, game, places to grow food. If we could file claim, build what they recognize as improvements. You would help us do this? Joseph asked. Teach us their papers and laws? If you would have me. The vote was close, but pragmatism won. They would try this new path, finding land, claiming it legally, building something that might last. But first, they had to evade the soldiers. The journey north was brutal. Margaret rode when she could, walked when she couldn't, always aware of Samuel's worried eyes on her. The baby seemed to sense the urgency, going quiet and still as they traversed narrow paths and steep climbs. On the fourth night, the pains began. Not now, Margaret gasped, gripping Samuel's hand. Too soon. But babies keep their own time. As a spring storm lashed the mountains, Margaret labored in a hastily erected shelter while the band stood guard against both soldiers and elements. Alona and the medicine woman attended her, their faces calm despite the circumstances. You're strong, Alona murmured. The baby is strong. Apache babies know how to survive. Hours passed in a haze of pain and determination. Samuel never left her side, letting her grip his hands until her nails drew blood. When she cried out, he sang, Apache lullabies his mother had sung, songs for welcoming new life. As dawn broke through the storm clouds, their daughter entered the world with a fierce cry that announced her intention to survive whatever came. She was small but perfect, with her father's dark hair and her mother's stubborn chin. What will you name her? Alona asked as she placed the baby in Margaret's arms. Margaret looked at Samuel, saw tears on his weathered face. Ayana, she said softly, for the grandmother who brought us together, and hope for what she represents. Ayana Hope Sosi, Samuel whispered, touching his daughter's tiny fist. Born between worlds, belonging to both. The camp celebrated quietly. They were still too close to danger for true festivities, but each member stopped by to welcome the new child, to offer blessings and small gifts. Joseph Birdsong himself performed the naming ceremony, declaring her a child of the band, protected by all. They reached the northern territories as summer peaked. The land was as Margaret remembered from old survey maps, harsh but sustainable, ignored by settlers who wanted easier pickings. Using her knowledge and a carefully hoarded gold piece from Samuel's trading, they filed claim on a valley with good water and sheltered areas for winter camps. The bureaucrat in the land office looked skeptical. You're claiming for the whole group? Family settlement, Margaret said firmly. Little Ayana sleeping against her chest. Extended family, all legal. It was, barely. Technically, but legal. They had papers now, borders recognized by law as well as tradition. It wasn't much, 160 acres of difficult land, but it was theirs. Building began immediately. Not a town in the white sense, but a settlement that honored both worlds. Adobe structures that could pass for improvements to satisfy legal requirements, but built in the traditional patterns. Gardens that mixed Apache knowledge with frontier techniques. A school where children would learn English letters and Apache stories. Word spread carefully, quietly. Other bands arrived. Cautious, skeptical, but desperate for stability. Some stayed, adding their strength to the growing community. Others moved on, but carried stories of the place where Apache could live without running. By autumn, when Ayanna had grown fat and laughing, crawling everywhere with determined curiosity, the settlement had taken shape. Samuel built furniture that traders came specifically to buy. Margaret taught letters and numbers to children eager to understand the white world's mysteries without losing their own. Ilona and the elders maintained the old ways, ensuring tradition survived even as they adapted. One evening, as the first snow dusted the mountains, Margaret stood at the edge of their hard-won valley. Samuel joined her, Ayanna on his hip babbling in a mixture of Apache and English that made them both smile. "My mother was right," he said quietly, though not in the way she imagined. "How so?" "She thought two broken people might make something whole, but we didn't just heal each other." He gestured at the settlement, the cook fires beginning to glow in the dusk, the sound of children playing. "We helped heal all of this. Gave people hope that there's a way forward that doesn't mean choosing death or surrender." Margaret leaned into him, her hand resting on Ayanna's back. "It's not perfect. The government could still—" "Yes, but we have papers now, laws, and more importantly, we have this." He indicated the people going about their evening routines, Apache and a few other native peoples who'd joined them, even a Mexican family who'd fled their own troubles. "Community, strength in unity. Your mother would be proud." "She is," Samuel said with certainty. "I feel her sometimes, in the wind, laughing at our strange solution. Proud we found a way." Ayanna reached for her mother, and Margaret took her, marveling as always at this small miracle they'd created. Born from loss and sorrow, raised in hope and determination. "What now?" Margaret asked. "We have land, legal standing, a growing community." "What comes next?" Samuel wrapped his arms around both of them, his wife and daughter, his unexpected treasures. "Now we live. We build, we teach Ayanna and the others how to walk in both worlds without losing themselves in either." He smiled. "We prove that love is stronger than hate, that different peoples can build something together. That's a lot to ask of one small valley." "Good thing we have stubborn people then." They stood together as night fell properly, the stars emerging in all their ancient glory. In the settlement, someone started drumming, a celebration rhythm, a welcome to night and promise of dawn. Other drums joined, and soon there was dancing. Apache patterns mixed with steps the Mexican family contributed, even Margaret's frontier reels finding their place in the mixture. "Come," Samuel said, leading them toward the firelight and music. "Our people are dancing. Our people." Margaret smiled at the words, at the truth of them. She thought of that dying Apache woman who'd walked bleeding feet to bring them together, of the violent loss that had shaped them both, of the winding path that led from despair to this moment of joy. "Thank you," she whispered to Ayanna's memory, to Thomas and James, to little Niall whose death had broken Samuel's heart and opened it to new love. "Thank you for leading us home." Then she joined the dance, Ayanna laughing in her arms, Samuel's hand warm in hers. Around them, their chosen family celebrated another day survived, another small victory against those who would see them erased. The silver bracelet caught the firelight from its place of honor in their home, testament to love that transcended death. Beside it, the carved horse stood complete, not perfect, but whole, like the life they'd built from fragments of loss and hope. Apache tradition and frontier determination, two hearts that had learned to beat as one. In the mountains, wolves sang their ancient songs. In the valley, a community that shouldn't exist thrived against all odds. And in the space between heartbeats, Margaret could almost hear Ayanna's voice on the wind. Two broken things made something whole. They had, and it was beautiful.